Welcome to Bold Agendas, the podcast for business leaders who are guiding their organizations through transformative change. I'm Mimi Brooks, your host, and today's conversation is a little different. We're not asking where AI is headed, we're asking how leadership teams make decisions when the future itself is unclear. My guest today is Ben Pring, an IT futurist, strategist, and longtime translator between the worlds of business and technology. Ben co-founded Cognizant's Center for the Future of Work, where he spent over a decade helping organizations navigate major shifts in work, technology, and leadership. He's also the co-author of What to Do When Machines Do Everything, a widely read strategy book that laid out one of the earliest and most practical frameworks for how businesses could respond to the rise of AI. In this conversation, we don't just talk about technology, we talk about alignment, about how senior leaders can navigate ambiguity, reduce noise, and build systems for strategic thinking when transformation just isn't technical, it's political, it's human, and it's happening in real time. I'm Mimi Brooks, your host, and this is Bold Agendas, how executive teams align when the future isn't clear. Let's get started. Okay, Ben, welcome to Bold Agendas. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really delighted to have you.
Yeah, great to be here, Mimi. Great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The timing of this, Ben, from my perspective, couldn't be more perfect because when we spoke about the potential interest and alignment of the podcast, I had asked if you could talk about some of the leadership challenges that we're seeing in terms of alignment in this difficult kind of naturally fragmented time. How do we get senior leadership teams aligned? And since I spoke with you, as I was saying a few minutes ago when we were off camera, I've had other guests on who are citing this issue of strategic alignment and the systems that aligned a leadership team, like governance, in the strategy phase and then in the subsequent operations phase, et cetera. So I think this alignment issue is top of mind to a lot of folks. We're seeing it in our own advisory work as well. So I'm really glad to have you here to talk about this issue of how do we align leadership and what do we see as some of the common issues that create, a fracture across the leadership team. So I know this is the basis of a lot of your advisory work. So I just want to, give you the mic for a while and let you kind of talk about who's pulling you into this kind of work and generally what you're seeing in terms of leadership team fractures.
Yes. No, I think this is fast becoming the sort of issue du jour, Mimi. It's, we've had now 2 or 3 years of this latest phase of interest in AI and, rather than sort of previous phases where there was a spike of interest and then the sort of thing went away. We had these so-called AI winters. There doesn't seem to be a sign of that currently. The interest is just continuing to be exponential. And I think this is now leading us into this next phase where people are realizing this is, in Google's language, code red. This is serious. They sort of issued this memo internally famously after OpenAI ChatGPT was launched, a code red. This is the biggest sort of threat to us ever. We've got to take this really seriously. And I think more and more organizations, not just in tech, but in all the important sort of sectors of business, are now realizing this is code red for them. This is a very, very real and present danger to business as usual. And, they need to react to this in a positive way. And if they don't, then, the downside is very real. So that sort of messaging, which has been seeping into senior folks' consciousness for a while now, I think is really, at the front of the prefrontal cortex, if you like. And the question thus becomes, what the hell do we do about this? How do we move our organization, maintaining and retaining the existing strengths, but also, the proverbial, changing the wheels on the car as you're driving along the freeway. How do we do that? And that generates all sorts of strategic questions, tactical questions, which are now becoming the agenda for senior leaders. And I'm sure folks listening to this will be very tuned into what's going on in the marketplace. Yes, just yesterday I saw Andrew Ng, one of the AI tech pioneers, announcing a new consulting business he's setting up with the Bain folks. OpenAI last week announced a consulting offering to sort of surround their core technology products. People who have seen the Economist article last week suggesting that Accenture are going to be wiped away by this, and Accenture now pushing back, saying no, the exact opposite of that, that now this becomes an organizational strategic thing and an alignment issue that we're Accenture more needed than ever. And I think there's certainly a very real threat of new entrants coming into the marketplace. There's a lot of chat on social media about McKinsey as a service, consulting as a service.
Right.
Folks at Horses for Courses, an analyst firm, have been talking about this idea of service as software, the kind of inverse of software as a service, and that's something that aligns with my thinking. And so those emergent threats are very real, but at the same time, I think the grown-up big businesses who are now faced with this challenge of really materially changing, they will lean on consulting advice, strategic advice to help them through these sorts of issues. Because whilst this technology is new, we've never seen anything quite as powerful as this before. That's absolutely undeniably true. The actual issues of change management, which are presenting themselves again, are not new at all. We've seen this movie before. 25 years ago, lots of businesses had a huge change management issue in relationship to the cloud. 20 years before that, there was a huge change in technology and movement into what was then called client server, and that was a huge change management issue. So the change management issue is just the same one again. Perhaps it's happening more quickly. Perhaps the stakes are higher. The prizes for success are greater. We see that in all the market valuations in Nvidia and other tech companies, and the penalty for failure is more severe and faster. But the actual change management issue is just the same. And I think it's a long-winded way of coming to your question. Really, this notion of alignment. It's really alignment within the senior leadership team, perhaps even above that at the board level. And then it's driving that alignment down into the operational parts of the business. And one of the characteristics of AI, which I think is, again, slightly sort of new and unique from previous periods of change, is that AI itself is such a fascinating thing, and it raises so many issues in thinking people's minds that there's a tendency in the conversation about AI to drift off into all of these very interesting detours, but ultimately detours which are cul-de-sacs, frankly, for senior leaders, because senior leaders of businesses in this late stage Western capitalist world that we live in can't really worry about 20 years' time and the social contract and what this is going to do to society in 20 years' time or 10 years. They have to be focused on generating predictable revenue expansion, margin expansion on a quarterly basis. And if they don't do that, then they're not going to be around to have this conversation in 20 years anyway. So I think the issue is really strategic, but it's also really more tactical about how do we inject AI into our business operations? How do we take out cost leveraging these new tools? And how do we expand our total addressable market using technologies which are still volatile, still somewhat unknown to us? The real cost benefit analysis of a lot of this technology is still not very well understood. And they're tactical issues more than strategic issues, which, as I say, have the sort of tendency to drift off into these abstract philosophical questions, which I love having as much as anybody, over a glass of red wine, but don't really impact the day-to-day, material challenge of running a business.
And yet, so you've covered so many
Right.
important points. I know. I just want to dissect it a bit
Yeah.
because I think you're putting big ideas on the table. So, the first one, is this idea of, the interesting opportunity that you see in the marketplace of creating a new breed of consultancy. And that's really what we're talking about, or at least that's what
Yeah.
they say they're doing and they think is needed. And in some ways, I guess it's not surprising, right, Ben, that there could be, it's reasonable to think that there are methodology approaches, that are not really commonly used in
Yeah.
consulting today that
Yeah.
might be needed, as we think about running these strategies going forward. And
Yeah.
that overlaps, in my opinion, to what you're saying about some of the unique paradigm shifts that are associated with AI. And
Yeah.
even if the change management challenge is a bit of a river that runs through it, I think about change,
Yeah.
people, process, behaviors, etc., culture change, as a river that runs through it. The paradigms that AI is introducing, back office to front office, centralized to decentralized, transactional to intelligent, etc., have some pretty significant implications in
Yep.
strategy, that seem to confound alignment of the senior executive team. It's almost how do we think about it, Ben? Like,
Yeah.
how do
Yeah.
we think about it and what it needs to be common in our perspective?
Yeah.
Not necessarily the philosophy of it or your idea of pace versus my idea of pace, but we could probably agree that there are some enterprise common ideas that could bind the leadership team going forward as we think about what is the North Star strategy,
Yep.
even though we continue to have our quarterly operational returns that, unless we take those on in some other way, are likely not going to go away.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, that's right. And there are lots of models out there in the industry that people will be sort of familiar with some of them and less familiar with others. And I'm sort of certainly not going to kind of do a review or kind of mark other people's homework and say, you should use this model. But I mean, some of the ones that I'm very familiar with and have, had exposure to and been part of, one would be, the McKinsey famous Three Horizons model.
Yeah.
People probably know that quite well. I think that stood the test of time. That is a good way to think about it, and to organize parts of the business across that framework, to me, make a lot of sense. So that's certainly one that people should be thinking about if they're not already. Another one, and again, my background in Gartner, full disclosure. People may know the pace layering model from Gartner, which again I think is a sensible way to think about this. And simply put, that what that suggests is that there are different layers within a business, kind of a layer cake idea. And the core central foundational systems of record, as some people might call them, sort of at the heart of the business, they don't change very quickly or very often, and they're difficult to change. Once you put a technology to run your payroll processing or your accounts receivable, that's a sort of architectural decision that you're making, and you're probably going to live with that as an organization for 20 years, 30 years. You're not going to rip these things out quickly. Then there are sort of layers in the middle, closer perhaps to the operations of the business out in the field, where certainly in the last few years, and the cloud revolution sort of enabled this and encouraged this, was that business executives could sort of go off and do something independently. I could have something for my business process in this region or this country independently, as long as it tied back into the systems of record. I had some latitude, some freedom to go off and make that decision.
Right.
Didn't need to be a corporate, it had
Yeah.
to meet sort of corporate governance thresholds, but somebody was empowered to go off and do that on their own. And then the further sort of the outer layer, if you like, this is really where a lot of SaaS took off. People would go off and buy their own solutions, doing the, using their own credit card, blah, blah, blah. So that model, thinking about that, again, I think that's a useful model to think about this issue. Where do we inject AI across that pace layering topology? And probably the logical thought and what's really happening in reality at the moment is that there's a lot on the edge and not very much in the middle. I mean, nobody's ripping out their Oracle, financial system at the moment to replace that with AI, and I think that's probably unlikely. That's going to happen for another few years, frankly. So that's another model people can look at, and then the more sort of prosaic and more mundane, but again, I think in the real world, sort of the way this is happening is that senior leaders, again, from that sort of ELT level down, should really be empowering people individually, collectively in their groups to do basically what the CEO of Shopify recently suggested was Toby Lutker. This is a memo that was released on Twitter a little while ago and caused quite a big stir. Was, in becoming AI first, an AI first organization, people should have to justify why they're not using an AI tool to do something, rather than the other way around, if you like. And I think, again, that's a good model for senior leaders to be broadcasting out sort of a company-wide APB. Follow that kind of approach. AI first. Look for the AI solution. Find the AI solution to your challenge, to the process you're responsible for, rather than just throwing people at it, rather than just throwing traditional technology at it. And I think senior leaders, this alignment issue, it's really a question quite simply and basically of banging that drum, continuing to bang that drum, finding the heroes who kind of follow that marching order, perhaps, being a little medieval with some of the people who aren't, and continuing to bang that drum and continuing to find those hero stories and socialize those around the business. Because I think, again, there's a lot of theory, there's a lot of abstraction around this conversation within businesses, as there is in the world at large. And it's really up to senior leaders to make that quite pragmatic, quite simple. And I think that's what that memo from the Shopify CEO really nailed very well.
Was really attempting to do. So, somewhere between, strategy, or somewhere between the intersection of strategy and day-to-day people and operations, we need to find a dialogue, right? We need to find a dialogue that would create alignment across.
I think the biggest danger, and again, I've seen this on my travels, I'm sure you have as well, Mimi, is that the strategic conversation is a sort of elegant one, a very sophisticated one, happens in nicely appointed conference rooms, and then it's sort of handed down like tablets from the mount.
Yeah,
and you folks go off and instigate that, and of course, it's the famous old phrase that strategy. Mike Tyson said, "Everybody's got a strategy until you're punched in the face." That strategy then doesn't survive first contact with the enemy, and then the blame on the blame in the discussion is, you didn't do the strategy. And a strategy that can't be executed in the real world, to me, is worth nothing, and in fact is what gives strategy consulting a bad name.
Yeah. So Ben, if we just looked at it in a practical sense, in an experiential sense,
yes,
and we asked the question, what is the basis of the misalignment at the SLT level, though? What are SLT members not aligned on that you see, when you walk in, as the fractures, the disconnects that's creating some, operational cohesion in terms of their approach?
Yes. Well, there's, again, lots of different elements to that. Some of them are just traditional, historical, as we've said already. Just this is normal. This is how change happens. Some people, want to move quickly. Some people don't want to move at all. Some people are progressive. Some people are cautious and conservative. So those sort of traditional psychographs, if you like, within a business, very, very normal. I think one of the biggest aspects of these fractures, and that's a very good word to use, I like that, it's a good way to think about it, is that, we famously said for many, many years, for decades, and certainly most of my career, that IT used to support the business. Now IT is the business. And there's a lot of people in business who are still not very comfortable with technology. Maybe that's surprising to younger folks, but certainly, if you're a 50-year-old CEO or 55-year-old CEO or CFO or, a very senior responsible role, it's very, very likely you haven't come up through a technology route. You didn't climb the technology ladder. You were a salesperson, you were a marketing person, you were a finance person. Technology was an element. You used technology, but you're not really a technologist. And so that's been changing. And, clearly there are more and more people who are these sort of hybrid centaurs who are business people, but really understand technology very well. I would say that that's still the vast minority. That's the exception. But that's got to change because if you're making bets on very, very sophisticated technology without understanding that in beyond a sort of rudimentary way, I think is very, very challenging and very, very problematic. And again, I think the history of a lot of different businesses is putting senior people, a senior person in charge of an airline that doesn't really understand aeroplane engineering or any of the technical elements. The same is true in the automobile industry. I mean, the automobile industry was founded by people who understood the technology of automobiles. Then we have, over 100 years, we have a generation of general managers who don't really understand that technology. And I think the evidence is pretty clear where that has led. And I think that sort of scenario, that sort of danger presenting around this issue at the moment. So I would think the need to promote or push forward people into general management, ELT level roles who really understand the technology very, very well is sort of paramount at the moment. And that's where one of the biggest fractures is, I think, from people who are comfortable with technology and people who are not comfortable with technology. And if you're a 50-year-old running a big organization at the moment and you're uncomfortable with technology, I think that's a tricky situation to be in because, how do you, you can take advice and guidance and recommendations from your technology people, and certainly that's sort of a completely normalized situation. But unless you're very, very comfortable and really understand this in some detail, I think that's one of these fractures, but perhaps is a hairline fracture at the moment, but has the potential to really, break that femur in a big way.
I wonder if you see this in your work, Ben, because it's a condition that I think we run into not uncommonly. And I would say it sounds something like this. The more that the transformation strategy is wholesale, either by the nature of the change that the organization is navigating or the size of the organization. It's a mid or smaller size company, and I can't isolate transformation to a group of senior leaders who have the skills and capabilities that you're talking about. They understand the technology to business, harmony. They can imagine a future state where the operations and work of the organization are quite different because they understand the characteristics or capabilities that are possible, or at least they can imagine them. Then we can decide, are we trying to anticipate multiple views of the future or a single view of the future, whatever. So the more that I can isolate transformation to a few executives, and the more that it implicates the whole leadership team or most of the leadership team, with a similar impact, the more I think we run into these leaders that are comfortable and ready in the discussion and leaders that are not. And now the challenge is really quite difficult. What do I do? Some would say, look, you're going to have to change out leadership team in the cases that you've got people that just can't run the play. Not uncommon. They ran yesterday's play They might not be your people to run tomorrow's play, etc. So, again, I want to say this idea of what binds the senior leadership team and what's the basis of we're all rowing in the same direction. Whatever it looks like, we're all rowing in the same direction.
No, that's the challenge of senior leadership, isn't it? That's why people like that get paid the big bucks, because doing that is very difficult. A lot of it is through tactical competence of leaders, and again, that's why knowledge around this technology is so important, because to fully embrace it, you've got to be comfortable with it, you've got to be competent with it. And people who are not competent tend to shy away from something. So if you feel threatened and uncomfortable with this LLM that we're talking about and how it could, recalibrate our back office process, well, can you really have a detailed, deep dive conversation about that, or lead in that? So there's all sorts of issues like that. So competence is a big part of it. And then from competence comes confidence. And from confidence comes conviction, and then you begin to get a virtuous cycle of competence, conviction, and confidence, and you can lead. And I think, again, that's where I see a lot of senior leaders struggling. They're not competent, particularly in this new world. They're not confident about their competence, and thus they have no conviction, and they're sort of bobbing around. Again, like, to use your metaphor, sort of bobbing around in a boat and in raging seas, and they frankly don't know where to go.
Yeah. The thing that's kind of interesting is sometimes, Ben, I think, and then I want to move us into, this business versus technology discussion. But sometimes I do think that the fear of the technology from a business perspective, is a bit unfortunate, because it can cause business people to leave their position in order to understand the technology almost in a way that, is not trying to contextualize the technology or characterize it to the business context. In other words, the people that know the business are people we desperately need. They know how the business really works. They know how decisions are made. They know where the knowledge sits. They know where the skeletons are. You know what I mean? Like, they understand how business gets done today. And if we apply this force of change to business, practices, programs, processes, et cetera, over time, they are in the best position to anticipate the impact to the business and how to manage through that. It almost seems to me at times, if we can describe the technology in its characteristic systemic state, in the way it influences and impacts work, so that people that have the context, don't feel like they're trying to become technologists as opposed to they're trying to become business solutionists.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Well, I think that you're describing, maybe in a way, the world in which I've lived my entire career, in which many consulting people do live. I sometimes jokingly describe myself as a translator. I can translate business into tech, and I can translate tech into business. And tech people are from Mars and business people are from Venus, or is it the other way around?
Right.
So that issue, again, is a long-standing issue, and that's why it's been very common for quite a while for senior executive teams. They call them safaris. They go to Silicon Valley and they do a safari. And they go and sort of meet all the Google guys or the OpenAI guys, and they go and see what's happening on the savannah out there. So that's, again, very common, and I think the better CTOs, certainly the better CIOs, that's been one of the big roles they've played historically, and probably more and more so in the last few years, as people have begun to realize how important tech is, that they're translators. They're trying to understand. They understand the business. They understand the technology. They understand how the two impact each other. And it's not saying that the technology people, the geeks, have taken over the world, and now they're the most important people in the world. They're trying to say, we understand what you're trying to do, selling this product out in the business, and we're here to help. Again, I think if you step back from this, all of this agita and Sturm and Drang is it's just normal, isn't it? This is the normal nature of change within large organizations, and large organizations are sort of living organisms. You're quite right. People come, people go. The organism is much bigger and more self-sustaining than any single individual, or single product, or single service, if it's really going to have a long lifespan. And so I think about what's happened in IBM. People might know the IBM story of the last 5 years or so. A generation of leaders who were really all in on AI and banging the AI drum for many, many years. Probably, a bit too early, frankly, if we look back on it now. And that generation of leaders got washed out. A new generation of leaders have come in, to my mind, haven't really done very much anything differently. But because the market has changed and the timing is perhaps better now, IBM are back. And there's lots of media at the moment about IBM's success story, and one of the most impressive stock performances of the last couple of years. And a lot of that, the rails for that foundational success were laid by the previous generation of managers and executives, frankly, probably not getting the credit they deserved. But again, that's sort of normal, isn't it? We've seen that movie as well before.
Well, it's kind of like what you say, right? So just to hang on that for a sec, and then I'll move us into this disintermediation translating role, because I think that's going to be an interesting one for our folks to hear. But as you said, I mean, if we look back on, the early days of the internet, when we've got big change like that happening, it's not uncommon, right, Ben, that we create temporary structures. The chief internet officer versus the chief information officer. You know what I mean? The CTO that's really more responsible for front office with a big F, the whole concept of technology out on, the fringe of the business, the front office, versus the CIO who might be doing infrastructure and maintaining, back office critical capabilities, including cyber, things like that. So it's not surprising that temporary structures get stood up to help us swallow the change and adapt to it until the rest of the organization, not everybody changes at the same pace and time, until the rest of the organization comes along and we have full or near full adaptation, absorption, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
And that's the cycle that you're saying, look, we've been here before. It's not like we haven't managed enterprise level change at times, holistic and certainly driven by
10 years ago, there was all the debate, should we have a chief digital officer?
Yeah, exactly.
And then 5 years ago, should we have a chief analytics officer? And now, should we have a chief AI officer? And I think the track record of those roles, or the longevity of those roles, is relatively short. Now, you're right. There may be some short-term logic to doing that. They're a change agent. They're a sort of catalyst for adaptation, as you rightly say. But they don't tend to stick around. They tend to be absorbed back into the business, as you say, as things become more mainstream and more mature. Again, businesses have centers of excellence around all sorts of disciplines, and particularly leading edge disciplines. And there are all sorts of centers of excellence around AI at the moment. And again, assuming they sort of take off and everything we're imagining happens, that AI becomes more and more important, they'll just be absorbed into the bloodstream of the organization and become completely normalized.
But then, as a technologist, I can say that, like, you're a technologist by background. Is that right, Ben? When I'm saying that, so as a technologist looking at AI and working now in AI, issues in a business. I mean, as a core idea of what you're doing, is there anything that you see in this change that you find a little troubling or unique? You know what I mean? That you would say, look, we've managed big change before, but the couple of things that I think we've got to pay close attention to that might not be the movie that we've seen in other times and other circumstances might be these kinds of things. Is there anything about the AI paradigm that causes you any pause?
Yes. No, again, it's a great question. And without veering off into these broader philosophical, socioeconomic discussions, which do, caused me to pause and think about, employment and what this means going forward. I think one of the biggest challenges in this phase of change, which is somewhat unique and very pressing for a lot of folks that would be listening to your podcast, is that the pricing premium for people who understand this technology is extraordinary. I.e., the people who really understand this technology and could really deploy it in a meaningful way are being paid a lot of money, frankly. And again, people may have seen the most sort of extreme versions of this. Mark Zuckerberg hiring people away from, for sports star, LeBron James style salaries. And so if you're a manufacturer in the Midwest of America, and you're recognizing that this technology is going to be important for you going forward, where do you get these skills? How do you hire these skills?
Yes.
You probably can't go to Accenture and afford Accenture. You probably can't go to McKinsey. You can't go to OpenAI directly. So where are you going to go and get these skills? The local community college, they're not really tuned into this in a material way yet. The local state college university is beginning to teach people this, but could you bring a 25-year-old kid into your business and get them to rewire your business? That would be a high risk bet that, not many leaders probably want to do. So I think that's one of the gating factors that is underappreciated at the moment.
Yeah.
Is that the number of people who really understand this technology in a material way and then can actually roll it out into your business is still relatively small, and their price point is very, very expensive. So that's a challenge that previous generations of technology have had a version of, but this differential in pricing power I think is kind of unique.
I think that's a big one, Ben, that I see. And related to what you're saying, if I look at it at an enterprise level, this readiness of people generally to step into new work across the board, frontline, back office, everybody, the readiness of people and organizational planning that partners with people in order to get them ready.
Yep.
Those programs are hard to find, Ben, especially in big legacy organizations.
Yes.
That have, big front lines, for example, union employees, for example, part-time workers, other, other augmented workforces as part of their overall human capital and labor. So, the readiness of people, the strategy around making big bets on what those time zones need to be for people to be ready. So we're not driving people, off a cliff here, giving them no possible way to be ready because we really didn't, figure out how to both plan that. And then a little bit to your point a moment ago, what policies we have around it. Like some progressive organizations, for example, are saying, look, we'll help invest in your retooling and retraining, and we expect you to do it on weekends and nights. This is the give and take. But listen, you can love that policy or hate that policy, but at least there's movement in terms of, recognizing that this issue of readiness of workers is something that, we're all going to win or lose by, and it could be pretty big in terms of its impact.
It's a huge issue. And again, people are waking up to this now. I was speaking at an event in Ohio last week, Columbus, Ohio, and the state government have mandated that schools, K through 12 schools, should be training kids, AI training, education for kids. The university system is beginning to do it, so it's beginning to happen. But obviously, if that 15-year-old isn't going to be a mid-level manager for 20 years. So. And I think that is, frankly, the reality of how this change is going to happen. It's going to be a generational change. Again, this is sort of what happened with the cloud story, with the software as a service story. It took a long time for that adaptation to occur. where, SaaS was completely normalized and, the routine way of doing things. This will be true in this revolution as well. No matter how fast the actual underlying technology is exponentially kind of growing, the adaptation curve for a business, for a society is much, much slower. And obviously the technologists don't want to say that. That's kind of boring, but that is the reality of how this is going to happen. I sort of, one of the phrases I use is sort of paradoxical, but I think it sort of captures this, is that, it's later than you think, so you've got to get on with this today. This isn't something, we're doing Q1 next year. It's later than we think, but at the same time, this is a generational wave. And, you have more time to figure this out probably than you think, as long as you start that longest journey with a single step now. This will take a long time to play out. And again, coming back to where we started with the McKinsey model, that the Three Horizons model, that's why that is a good model, because that recognizes that really profound change in those core system of record, in that pace layering model from Gartner, that will take a generation. That'll take 20 years, 30 years. And again, there will be progressive businesses, leading edge business, early adopters who get there in 5 years. But the vast majority of the marketplace, and frankly, from a commercial perspective, the vast bulk of the money on the table for consulting people to grab, that will take a while as well. And again, I think that's reflected in some of the valuations of consulting companies at the moment, which are kind of way down, and why all the investable money is chasing all the technology, the shovel makers, because people realize that that's a kind of long run game.
If I summarized that, Ben, I would say in terms of the paradigm then is the paradigm that we might be concerned about here as being, somewhat unique compared to where we've been before, could be this idea of pace and impact over organizational adaptation, right? The pace and impact of this and what that looks like relative to the plan for organizational response, which, as you said, is always going to be slower. So the question is, what bets are you going to make? What are you going to do?
Well, again, I think that's why the pace layering idea is a good one, and why, sort of picking your spots. Let's not think we're going to change the business overnight. Let's go and find this division in this region doing this thing, and let's concentrate on getting some AI early wins there. And then we'll kind of string of pearls that out into other parts of the business.
That's right. So the likelihood of, us deciding exactly where we're going to land 3 years from now in terms of, exactly where we're going to be in the map is probably less the exercise than momentum, though, right?
Yes,
Then momentum,
I think, one of the sort of metaphors I've always used to think about this is when I used to be driving down to New Jersey a lot from Massachusetts, I'd see the new Tappan Zee bridge being built. And I used to think, should a business refurb the old bridge, or should a business build a new bridge? And the way it works out is most organizations refurb the old bridge until they feel they can't do that anymore, and then they start building a new bridge. And I think that's probably, a metaphor for a lot of the technology and infrastructure within a lot of organizations. They'll keep on painting the old bridge and putting a new girder in on the old bridge, and at some point they'll recognize that it's no longer fit for purpose, and we need to build a new bridge, a new Tappan Zee bridge. But I think for most businesses, they're still in the old bridge world. The Tappan Zee model is still a few years out, frankly.
Yeah. And I think that's a good analogy. And if I was going to say what I think the structural idea is that you're pointing to from a business perspective is the business architecture, the scaffolding of business architecture, for the future versus the scaffolding of business and enterprise and technology architecture that we have in our old models. And what's more ready, right? Is one more ready to be adapted and changed?
Yes.
Or, is there so much both technical and organizational debt there, Ben? So much debt in that model, that rescaffolding it, is going to be a lot uglier and have fewer
And I think
assets than what
that's
we
right. And I think the
expected.
answer to that is very varied by industry, by individual
Absolutely.
organization within. I mean, I remember a few years ago, I was at a presentation talking to a big client of Cognizant at the time, a big insurance company, and I was sort of extolling the benefits of the future. I'm a futurist, come in and talk to us about the future, Ben. I'm in there and, having a great conversation with people. And then one quiet guy in the corner of the room just sort of quietly said, well, this is all very interesting, Ben, but did you know that if we, and the insurance company, didn't sell another insurance policy from tomorrow, we would still be a profitable business in 100 years' time based on all the policies they've already
Yeah.
sold. So
Yeah.
that's to your point, Mimi, that the business model there doesn't really encourage, there's no real incentive for innovation and changing the bridge, if you like,
Exactly.
because that bridge is a very, very powerful, successful bridge, which is going to be there for 100 years, long after this generation of leadership. Now, not every industry can, has that the
Backlog.
benefit. Exactly.
Right. That visibility, that
Yes,
backlog.
exactly.
Yeah. So that's an and
But again,
idea.
that's very specific to that industry, and it should, in the Warren Buffett
Appropriately
phrase, show
so.
me the incentives, I'll show the outcomes. Their incentives are not aligned to major technological change. Other industries, media, where change can happen very, very quickly,
That's right.
streaming can replace cable very quickly. They are incentivized to chase innovation. So again,
That's right.
the answer sort of depends on, there's not a one size fits all model for every industry.
I think that's a key idea because in the example that you bring up, Ben, that then begs an and idea. I fix some of the scaffolding and I build a new bridge,
Yes.
as opposed to an or idea,
Yes.
So
And
I think that's
what those insurance
perfectly.
companies what they tend to do, and it's like a lot of different businesses talking about media, is they basically allow the R&D to happen in an outsourced fashion. When somebody comes up with a new model which is good and they can see traction in the market, they just go and buy it. So you don't do
That's right.
you don't do the innovation yourself. You just watch what's going on in the marketplace, and then anything looks good, any film studio that has a small independent has a hit, then Warner Brothers come in and buy it. So again, that model is a well tried and trusted model, and that probably
Totally.
plays out again.
Exactly. What are your assets now? What are your assets later? What's the likelihood of them being the same? Do they become liabilities faster than they retain their value, et cetera, et cetera? So I would say, organizational adaptation relative to pace of every business uniquely, not what everybody else is doing. And then the second issue of, business model and business architecture today versus business model, business architecture of tomorrow. What's the relationship between the two of those? And what am I going to do to start, pivoting towards the future state? And what does it mean in terms of dismantling the current state? Am I going to?
No, I think AI and the power of AI is certainly making all of these issues, very, very pressing. But I think we're yet to, and I think off stage, a lot of what is happening, we've been talking a lot about sort of change management consulting. I think a lot of what is happening in the marketplace at the moment, or pre-marketplace at the moment, is, if you're a 35-year-old principal in Accenture or Deloitte or, 38, and so you've got all of that experience on your resume, you've learned the models, you know how to sell, you know how to deliver. I bet that's the profile of somebody who's going to spin out of Accenture or Deloitte or Cognizant, set up their own business using this technology to deliver these services in a Clayton Christensen model, lower price, slightly less functionality, but that's going to be attractive to a potential buyer, and come into the marketplace and disrupt the established incumbents where that person used to work. I don't think that's happening yet.
Yeah.
That's what I imagine is going to happen in the next few years. And again, if I'm the buyer, if I'm the CIO in Bank of America and I want a different model, I'm sort of frustrated with my incumbent suppliers and I want something different. well, where is that? Where can I go and buy from tomorrow?
Exactly.
It
Exactly.
isn't in the marketplace until there's something in the marketplace that I can shoot at and point at and tell my CEO about. And while they're using it, we should use it. And I think this is the sort of pre-Cambrian moment we're at the moment, where that hasn't really emerged. I fully expect it will emerge in the next few years. And then all these issues of change management will become more real and more pressing. But
Yeah.
again, that's not quite where we're at the moment, I think.
I think you're right. Jeff Moore said it, well, when I spoke with him a couple of weeks ago, he said, look, these consulting companies are being disrupted like everybody else. There's not something about their services, that, aren't being affected by the same level of magnitude within the context of their industry and whatever. And, some will pivot faster and slower. Some will be more effective. But if you're looking for advice and counsel from people who can help you on that journey, but they don't know it themselves, that's going to be difficult. It's not going to be surprising that people are going to go outside to augment some of this advisory, roles that might be difficult to get. And, what you can pay and what size organization you are to, garner the best minds thing, all that matters too, right? So, yeah, it'll be interesting to watch. So Ben, this idea of brokering the relationship between the business and IT. I mean, this seems like you frequently have one foot in one camp in terms of understanding, what people are thinking and concerned about and how to talk to them.
Yeah.
One foot in the other, which makes you, a viable moderator, in such a situation. So
marriage guidance counseling.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Everyone's a coach. Here we are. So Ben, can you tell me, what the nature of these, mediated discussions are that you have when you step into an organization like this? What are you finding, and how do you handle, these different perspectives? And is it this idea I was saying to you? Is it just two doors into the same party where I have to explain, look, your door looks like this and your door looks like that, but fundamentally we're all in the same party at the end of the day. We just don't understand each other. Is it two doors into the same party, or is it two doors into two different parties? And in fact, we're trying to bring people together to establish the common so the dialogue can happen.
What I find, Mimi, and again, this may just be the work that I do and the sort of opportunities I get involved with. So I'm not going to generalize that this is a totally kind of common experience. But my role, in a way, I think is almost as a facilitator of this conversation that we're having between people who have different perspectives on the world, on their business, on the technology that may or not be relevant to that organization. It's really allowing the differing voices to be surfaced in a sort of environment that tolerates difference of opinion and values difference of opinion. I mean, the most common sort of experience I have is I'll go into a room and I'll into a boardroom, a senior leadership team or whatever, and there'll be 20 people in the room. And after I've been talking about technology, what I think is going on, what I think is important, and what I think people should be paying attention to, you'll begin to get a sense from, as the conversation develops, as questions develop, who's excited about this, who's not excited about it, who feels emboldened and energized by this, who feels threatened. And those sort of tensions, again, your word from earlier on, the fractures, begin to become more obvious. And I'm not there to say, you're right or you're wrong, and you're a Luddite, and you because you've heard of some cool tech, you should be the boss of this conversation. It's really to surface that discussion and allow the organization to have that discussion, the team to have that conversation themselves. And there's value to them in doing that, because oftentimes that conversation isn't happening. I mean, it might be happening in pockets. It might be happening between two people who are simpatico and aligned, but getting all of those people to talk, and then allowing the senior people, the people of influence within that room, to be able to, express their opinion, curate their opinion, try and drive consensus, which isn't going to happen just in one conversation, but perhaps begins to happen. That's what I tend to sort of be involved with, those sorts of engagements, those sorts of projects. And oftentimes that can lead into downstream work from then replicating that lower down the organization, where again, those conversations are probably happening, but in an ad hoc way and not very structured way. So that tends to be what I'm involved with. And again, my observation is that that's very normal. I've seen that scenario thousands of times over a long, number of waves of change, and is in some ways, part of the baby steps of the journey, the organization is on to reaching to, or at least attempting to try and reach the alignment that, quite rightly you're suggesting they need to get to.
So I like the way that you say that, Ben. If I said it back to you as, I feel like you describe, I was using this language of disintermediating, what could be conflict or misunderstanding, but it sounds more like a conduit idea based on what you're saying, that what you're trying to do is enable the conversation to happen. Let me kind of bring the conversation forward, bring it out, bring it up, get it on the table, and then, expecting leadership in their various different roles, chairman of the board, CEO, whatever it is, CIO, to then be able to kind of come in and, say what they want to say, establish priorities as they see them, etc.
That's right. Again, one of the common sort of phenomena that it repeats and repeats, but again, is sort of repeating faster at the moment, is that, technology, again, this has been a sort of characteristic of technology for 30 years or so now. Technology used to sort of come from the top down. It was big organizations, the DARPA world, the military world. They would come up with the technology and it would sort of be bought at the top and then would permeate down into the business. That's inverted in the last 30 years. And technology happens at ground level, small entrepreneurial innovators doing, things over there on the fringe in the shadows. And so if you're a senior leader and you're time starved and you're busy, and again, you're under that Q by Q drumbeat pressure, you probably don't really know what's going on the edge of the business. You don't know what your competitors are doing. You don't know what some weird little technology could potentially do. And so even just having the ability to surface some of these new ideas in this environment and say, have you thought about this? Have you seen this? What does this potentially mean to you? Having that conversation in this room where there are people who are kind of excited by that and some people who are, disinterested or terrified, again, that can be very valuable. And some businesses do that process well, and they do it repeatedly as a program. And I think that's good practice to have that as a normalized part of the sort of cadence of a management process. More often it's the case that businesses do that as a one-off project when they feel some catalytic force in the marketplace. Oh, this happened. We should all talk about it. And well, that's okay, but it's not as good as having a kind of regular programmatic way of having that conversation and keeping that conversation going.
Ben, another, way that you kind of have your finger on the pulse just to get, a different perspective based on the forum is the speaking that you do, the speaking at associations, organizations, etc. What do you learn there, Ben? Like, what have you learned in the past year or so since you've been doing these talks about what's top of mind to people? What are the things that you answer questions about most often? What do people seem worried about or afraid of or uncertain of, that come out in these forums?
Well, no, it's a great question. And it's a sort of interesting phenomena that I've experienced over the last, 10 years or so, talking about AI now. Amazing to think it's that long. But is that I'll go into a conference or a boardroom and talking to senior people. And as I said at the top of this podcast, I always like to try and make this a practical conversation.
Yeah, I see that.
A mix between strategy and tactics.
Yeah.
Really, not let it become too airy fairy and philosophical. But it's sort of amazing that you go in and you talk to senior people, and it starts as a business conversation, but very quickly it sort of diverts into being a socio-economic, philosophical discussion about the future of work and is there a future for work? And very commonly for middle-aged people, it's, what the hell are my kids going to do? Are they going to be stuck in my basement for the rest of their lives because they're not going to be able to get a job? And that's, it's interesting and frankly a little alarming. It's sort of become normalized to me. Last week I mentioned I was speaking in Ohio, and I was talking to this audience, a sort of Salesforce.com themed audience. And one of the things I was saying is one of the aspects of this technology that's becoming very real and very apparent is that it's really upping the game, the upping the skill level that people are going to need. And, businesses are going to need more highly skilled people. And somebody, in the Q&A said, well, how are young people going to get into this world if we're sort of taking the bottom rungs of the ladder away from them? And that's a very, very real question, a question I worry about. But it's interesting. I was there to talk about Salesforce, and that's what somebody in the audience is thinking about. So it's certainly, and that wasn't the case when I was talking about Salesforce 25 years ago, or when I was talking about SAP 35 years ago. We weren't having those sorts of philosophical socio-economic discussions. But nowadays, everybody is thinking about, what does this do to jobs? And what does this do to my future, my family's future, my society's? So, that is a very real phenomena. And it's obviously a new phenomena in talking about tech.
Yeah. Yeah. It really does get, people really do intellectualize it very, personally, very quickly. That's what they're worried about, right? Which of course makes sense,
Well, and I think this again, in this management challenge that you're laying out, and the audience you talk to, Mimi, are interested in this management challenge. This is going to be one of the aspects of that management challenge, taking people along with you on this journey, this change journey, and giving people a reason to believe that you want them to come on the journey with you, rather than you just want to replace them all with technology. And I think that's what a lot of people feel, and it's going to be hard to sell a message of change. Turkeys don't vote for Thanksgiving if this technology is all just about replacing people.
I think it's the biggest issue, honestly, Ben. I think so many issues come back, to the engagement and readiness of people, and what, seems to be needed as a leadership belief that automate everything that you can, and people will still be the point of differentiation within your company. And if that's the case, and we have this chasm of organizational readiness, if we did start earlier, just one foot in front of the other, you're going to trip sometimes. We're not going to get it right all the time. But if we started sooner and we can engage people in that co-creation process, I think it at least creates the possibility that they'll have some skin in the game. Then they will have had some input, some ideas, good ideas to share, especially as we start talking about, the redesign of.
No, I think
work as we know it, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the upside of a lot of this is getting lost at the moment, is getting drowned in the downside of this. The upside is that, we're going to create better jobs, better paid jobs.
Absolutely.
And that prosperity for you individually, for your company, your society, is a good thing. That's the story of technology over the last 300 years. That message isn't resonating as strongly as it perhaps should at the moment. And the people who are able to tell that story, their voices are kind of sotto voce at the moment. And I think that needs to change. Mr. Mark Benioff from Salesforce wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, exactly along those lines. But that message is sort of getting drowned out, I think, a bit at the moment.
I think it is. And I think the problem is, to the discussion at the very beginning, Ben, that we were having, that, there's the concern, I think, there's a concern of the executive team about not talking about gobbledygook as a strategy that people are like, what are they talking? You know what I mean? And it's esoteric and it's so far removed and it doesn't really have anything to do with me. Like you can't contextualize it to my perspective, etc. You know, that isn't the way that we have to socialize, you know, strategy and strategic thinking. We can contextualize it and socialize it to people in the context of what they care about, you know, the value that they add, the changing value proposition of individuals, the changing value proposition of organizations. Yeah. What's the win-win idea of our brand, our purpose, your purpose, you know, those things coming together and then being able to say, because we start early enough, look, we don't have all the answers, but we are pretty sure that we all just need to walk. Can we just walk in the same direction here, you know, and engage people to learn with us? You know,
well, I mentioned Andrew Ng earlier on, and this tie-up he's now got with Bain. He said something a few years ago, and it's something I've parroted and leveraged. I think it's a good way of thinking about this. He said that anybody who works in a finance role, very comfortable with spreadsheets, kind of a desk jockey, a spreadsheet jockey, they should do an evening class on Coursera, which is his sort of learning platform, and it was self-promotion, but mild self-promotion. Do a course, a 6-week course on AI, then redo their resume saying, I'm a finance professional, an AI finance professional. And then he said that people who were doing that were getting job offers for, you know, if they put their double the salary that they were getting before. So that's the argument. Yes. That if you do this X plus AI, you're a finance person, add AI. If you're a doctor, add AI. Or a teacher, add that. That's how you get to the next performance threshold, the next salary threshold. I believe that. I think there's good logic to that. And I think that message needs to be beaten, that drum needs to be beaten, you know, more loudly, because that is really the only alternative. The other alternative is just to stay a headlight, you know, a deer in the headlights.
Exactly.
And you're going to get run over. Whereas there is a very tangible, tactical, straightforward path. And it's not that difficult, I don't think.
Well, you know, I was gonna end the conversation, so probably a good time, you know, because I saw in one of your articles, I can't remember where I saw it, articles, white papers, you know, that you would reference Kevin Kelly's X plus AI idea, X, my job, I'm a doctor, plus AI, etc. Yeah. And that's a good individual way of looking at it, right? Yeah. And if I'm a business leader and I can encourage people to do that while I'm trying to show them how that idea, you know, that post idea of X fits into my organization this way, you know, with this level of value. Now I'm career pathing people. Now I'm showing people where they fit into the future. You know, I'm not trying to career path you to another company who has vision that I don't have. Yeah. You know, that's not terribly smart, you know. So if I can put those two ideas together, I think this is where vision matters. You know, strategy that is just a big fat book weight on people's desks. I see it everywhere, Ben. I see it everywhere. And it's produced by all the management consultancies, all the big consultancies. You know, the amount of effort and the amount of what gets operationalized is minuscule. Yes. But what we didn't get as a byproduct was we didn't get the vision, you know, that was optimistic, even realistic enough, but optimistic as it should be. Otherwise, what are you doing it for? You know what I mean? What are you working there for? Yeah. You know, if we can't create that optimistic vision for people, we're not creating it for machines, you know, for people. What is the point? What is the point? And what is the job of leadership if it isn't that, you know? And if we could do that, then I imagine we could, you know, get people to co-create with us, which would be kind of fun anyways.
No, I think that Kevin Kelly model, that X plus AI model, it's a very simple, obvious idea, isn't it? But I think
it really is.
It is completely actionable for everybody, from that CEO, that board, down to, you know, entry level person. In fact, there's another tech CEO, a guy called Aaron Levy, who's the CEO of Box and is quite a storage SaaS company. He's quite prominent on social media. I just saw him the other day saying, if you're a young person entering the workforce now, there's a tremendous opportunity for you, if you understand all this new tech, to kind of teach be a reverse mentor to the more senior people above you. And I think that's exactly right.
Exactly. I mean, even if you're not a particularly strong tech person, ask the question.
You probably know more than that 40-year-old or that 50-year-old.
Seriously, ask the question from this door to the party then. What's likely the sustainably human ideas, that I can make contributions towards? You probably won't be terribly wrong on that either.
Yeah.
What are those?
I certainly, maybe this will change in another 50 years or another 100 years. I don't really want to go and see a robot doctor. I want to go and see a human who's using the latest tech. I don't want my kids or my grandkids to be with a robot teacher. I want a teacher to be. So that's the idea, that, again, we want the human touch. We want the human experience. I think there might be a small minority of real nerdy techie people who probably prefer never to talk to another human being at all in their life. But that's not the mainstream of humanity. We live in a Barbra Streisand world. People want people, and
right.
But we want people to be using the latest things to make things easier and faster and hopefully cheaper. And again, that's the human story, using tools to be able to do that. And so it's very human to fear what's under the bed and what comes next and what's around the corner. But at the same time, it is the story of our development over thousands of years, certainly in the last 250, 300 years, to use tools to change society. Some individuals don't come on the ride and get washed away, but we wouldn't be living in the modern world that we're living in if we had all been Luddites 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Society wouldn't have developed in the way it has.
That's right. And as you said, the shifts that we've already been seeing towards, the value of human experiences is a pretty reliable, trend to watch, right?
One of the sort of counterintuitive ideas I've been talking about for a few years is that, I've certainly, I don't know whether you'd agree, Mimi, certainly seen in my time in America, the last 26 years or so, is that customer service has degraded in business, in retail, in entertainment, restaurants. I think that we're going to see a renaissance of customer service. And I think, 100 years ago, wealthy people sent their predominantly daughters, not exclusively, but predominantly daughters, to Switzerland to go to a finishing school, to learn manners and how to, be polite and polite. I think we're going to see a renaissance of an idea like that we need to reinvent the whole notion of bedside manner, the human interaction, because that's what we really value, I think. And if machines are going to be doing the sort of transactional parts of a process, then we want the humans to add the human element of the process. I always think that, like, if you go into the Apple store, all of the transactional parts are all handled on tech, but there's all these people in the t-shirts. Can I help you? Can I show you this? That human experience in a technology shop. I mean, that's what differentiates Apple from going to Best Buy or going to Walmart or something like that. And that human experience is ultimately, I think, what we value, plus the cool technology.
Exactly. I have to tell you, it's so funny that you say this. This morning I was reading a quick white paper, and then I'm going to stop because I could talk to you all day, Ben. So, I was reading a white paper on LinkedIn from my friend Michael Carroll. I don't know if you follow Mike Carroll. If you don't, you should. He's a good guy, and you would like him. And a lot of your thinking is similar. And he's talking about AI's new burden and the concept of. I'll try to get it really short. When we make the hard easy, when AI makes the hard easy, what do we make the easy then? And that's really what you're talking about.
Yeah.
When we don't have the burden, I mean, the optimistic view, when we don't have the burden of unsafe, when we don't have the burden of transactional, when we don't have the burden of findability and accessibility, we don't have the burden of being the point of rationalization, in a very process-centric world. Those workflows are process-centric. Early in my career, I was a human interface designer, human factors engineer. And we used to say, look, you have to know when you're making people the point of rationalization, because that's a burden and it's not fun. And you say people are going to love it, and they don't love it. They don't love it. They never wanted to self-serve like that, So when we make the hard easy, what do we make the easy? And I think that's the human side that you're pointing to. We make it empathetic.
There'll always be value in that. And I think
that's right.
We've forgotten that as a society.
Yes.
And I think there will be a renaissance of that, and the value will accrue again to those human characteristics and qualities.
Thank God we solved it, right, Ben? Thank God we solved it. I mean, it just took an hour of discussion to get on the same page. I am with you. Ben, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing, your legendary experience. A little bit of a private joke here. And I appreciate it a lot. And I'm sure that our audience will. And by the way, any books or anything in your future? Or are you done with your authoring?
No, who knows? Who knows, Mimi? Yeah, lots of ideas floating around and thinking about it. Watch this space.
I'll watch it and I'll keep in touch. And maybe we can talk, a year from now or so and see what you've been up to. I'd love that.
Fantastic. It's been great talking to you, Mimi. Thank you so much.
Great talking to you. Nice to meet you too. Thanks, Ben.
All the best. Bye.